Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 3, Project Monitoring and Closeout. My name is Kim Blessing, and I am one of the trainers for this module. Now, if you have taken our other trainings, this slide will be familiar to you. We are talking about the last 2 out of 5 phases of project management. We will be talking about project monitoring and project closeout. Under project monitoring, we have the implementation processes, monitoring project performance, and taking corrective action. And then for project closeout, we have a closeout process, discussion about no-cost extensions, and reporting. Again, this module series of project management focuses on project monitoring and closeout. So once you have started up your project, and everything has gotten going, you have things in place. This module is about ongoing monitoring, and then when you're done, closing out the project to make sure that you've completed everything, you've finalized all of your reporting, and everything has come in under budget. For the learning objectives in this module, you should be able to, at the end, demonstrate maintenance of a work plan, develop strategies for potential challenges that might arise during management of your project, implementing project closeout activities, understanding the process for a no-cost extension should you need an extension to the end of your project, and implementing strategies to tell the project story in your final report. We're going to start with project monitoring. So the implementation process for monitoring your project is successful implementation requires constant monitoring and organization. These 2 things are really key to successful project management. And there are lots of tools that you can use in order to implement your project successfully and monitor it throughout the life cycle of your project. You can use work plans and timelines. Work plans are detailed documents that include all of the information about how you're actually going to perform the work. They typically include timelines, staff assignments, task descriptions, and a comments area or notes area where you can constantly update as things change throughout your project. One of the keys to project management is understanding that no matter how well you've planned, things will change. Things will come up that you don't expect, and your work plan will help you to keep track of those changes as well as adapt as they come up. You will also have your budget as part of your project. This is also a key tool to project management. Your budget is how much money that you have to spend on your project and how it will be allocated. So it will include staffing, other costs, and how many labor hours you have to work with, among other things. You also have communication channels as your tools, and there can be a broad variety of tools: email, phone calls, video conferencing, sometimes texting. There are a lot of different communication channels that you can use and tools for managing your project. You also will probably have reporting templates, and this really varies by project. Most likely you'll have a final report at the end of the project, but you might have monthly or even weekly reports that you need to provide to your funder. You also have your statement of work, which is the document that outlines the work that you will be doing. So some actions that you can take when you're working with these tools is to schedule regular check-ins. And you'll want to check in often with your funder, and we're going to be talking about communication with your funder here later on in the module. But you want to schedule regular check-ins with the funder. You also want to schedule check-ins with your team. So whoever's helping you to do the work, so that everybody knows what they're doing and what the next steps are. You're going to want to monitor your budget, and you'll monitor that often, and we'll talk a little bit more about ways to do that later on. You're also going to want to update your work plan, and I'll be showing an example of a work plan here in a few slides and talk about how you can update that. Consult your statement of work, so make sure that that is handy at all times. so that you can easily consult it when there is a question on whether something falls into that statement of work. It'll also help you answer questions from your staff about next steps or timelines or what they need to be doing as part of the project. And then you'll need to develop reports. As I mentioned, you'll probably have your final report, but there may be some interim reports as well that you'll need to develop. So I'm going to I'm going to switch over to a sample work plan and share my screen. So here we have a sample of a work plan, and this is used in a tool called Smartsheet. Smartsheet is a really easy to use and effective project management software, but you don't need anything fancy. A lot of people also use Microsoft Project, which is a really robust piece of software that a lot of times if your project is fairly simple or you don't need all of those extra features, you don't really need Microsoft Project. It was really designed for kind of larger kind of construction projects and things like that, where there are a lot of different moving pieces and different budgets and things like that. So while you can use it, there's just a lot of features that you probably won't need. And that's one of the reasons that makes Smartsheet so easy to use, is it doesn't have a lot of extra things that you don't really need. It works very similar to Excel. So if you're used to working in Excel, it can be really easy to use. But like I said, you don't really need a lot of fancy tools. You don't need Smartsheet to do a work plan. You can build it in Excel. You can use a Word document. So really, whatever tool that you're most comfortable in is one that you should use. And as I mentioned previously, your work plan will have different parts. So this one has the task name. You can see that up there in one of the columns. It has a start and a finish. It has an assigned to column, as well as comments. So the task name, this is really where you'll start to fill this in, is your statement of work. So you look at your statement of work and add the task names, and then you can build out those steps from there. Now this would all have been completed in the setup process. So at this point with project monitoring, you have this all set up and ready to go. So that's where this work plan is. So then it's got the task, and then it's got the start and the finish. And then you can drop in the assigned to. So the comments column is really important throughout the life cycle of your project. This is where you're going to keep track of all of those things that change. So if there's staffing changes, if your funder comes back with different information or different requests and has you change direction, you can track all of that through there. So as soon as it happens, go to your work plan and update it with the comments. You can also adjust the start and the finish date as you're monitoring and updating your work plan. So if the due date changes, there's various reasons that can happen. Including direction from the funder, you can go in and change that. But if you make a change to that date, make sure that you note that in the comments, that the end date changed for this reason. If any quantities change, or if you're tracking if a certain task has a quantity of items in it, say, for example, maybe you have 4 meetings that you have to conduct throughout the course of the project, and you've already completed 1 of 4, you can put that in the comments. So if there are any multiples of one particular task, you can track how many you've completed at one time. So the work plan, again, is a really key piece of managing your project, and it's very important to keep that up to date. You don't want to get direction from a funder and wait on adding that into the comments, because as time goes on, we all lose those details. So as soon as it happens, go into your work plan and add those comments. And work plans can be as detailed as you need them to be. So you don't have to just rely on the tasks from your statement of work. You can go in and add those interim steps. And then as you're monitoring the work plan, if there's other steps that come up, you can always add those as you go along. So this is really designed to be a living tool for you throughout the course of your project. And then can I switch over to the PowerPoint, please? All right, so we're going to talk about some challenges that you might encounter in the implementation of your project. As I mentioned before, things always change in a project. And you know, the most effective project managers are ones that can roll with those changes and adapt as they come up and come up with creative solutions for addressing them. So some of the implementation challenges that can come up are staff workloads. So this could be internal to your organization, or it could be external with your funder. You know, we're all very, very busy right now, and managing those workloads in order to get the work done can be a challenge. There's also communication challenges, especially, you know, if a lot of people are working in a remote environment. You know, people can go on vacation. There might be miscommunication. You know, emails can get missed, things like that. There can be challenges with communication. There can also be changes in cost. So maybe when you're setting up the budget in the beginning, things cost items had a certain cost, or there was an estimate on how long they would take, and then that when you actually go in to do the work, the amount of time that is taking might change. So these are all some examples of things that can come up when you're implementing related to changes in cost. You also might run into what we refer to as scope creep. So in your statement of work, that is the scope of the project. It lists out everything that you need to accomplish throughout the course of the project. Sometimes there can be some requests that come in, maybe from the funder, that change that scope, or that might lead to changes in that scope that don't necessarily quite fit into that statement of work. And you have to determine whether or not it's part of the current scope, or if it falls outside of the scope, and then how do you address that? And so that's scope creep. So these are just a few of the challenges that could come up while you're managing your project. And we're going to talk about some ways to mitigate those challenges when they come up. So some of the mitigation strategies for these challenges. This one is always important throughout every stage of your project, is communicate early and often. You want to make sure that your team members know their roles and responsibilities from the very beginning, and that you update them on a regular basis. That's why I talked about in the beginning, is set up those check-in calls with your team. And the larger the project and the more people you have working on your project, the more important that this becomes. So you want to know that everyone understands what they're doing on the project, they understand the work plan, and they understand the timeline. So everyone is really clear on when things are due and what the next steps are. You also want to communicate with your funder. So that includes sharing information about challenges that come up, you know, any issues that you're running into, and make sure you do that as soon as possible. As soon as you know that there's a barrier, or you might see that a barrier is coming, you might anticipate that a barrier is coming, and just really keep that line of communication with your funder open. And then share your successes. That's always great too, because you want to be able to, you know, you don't just have to share the problems, you want to share those successes so that everyone can celebrate them and can learn from them. So if something worked in one area or one task, maybe it'll work in another. You also want to monitor your budget really closely. So set up that process on how to monitor the budget early, and then you can also plan for closeout. And we'll be talking about closeout here later in the module. So you work with your accounting team, work with anyone who's going to touch your budget to set up that process to monitor it. And you'll want to not only you know, work with your accounting team, but make a plan for reconciling invoices. You know, if other members of your team are going to be doing purchase authorizations or things like that, you want to have all of that process set up ahead of time. So it's really easy to monitor your budget. And you want to do that at least once a month, you know, reconciling invoices. But if you're monitoring labor hours and other parts of your budget, you want to do that at least every couple of weeks through the course of your budget or course of your project. And then you'll do that, you should do that even more often in closeout. But again, we'll be talking about that here in a little bit. You also want to identify your team members or leadership team who can help you with challenges. So a big part of project management is relationship and collaboration with other people. So, you know, identify those team members who will help you in case any challenges do arise. Maybe something comes up that you're not sure how to address. Who can you reach out to help you figure out and troubleshoot and think through some of the solutions that you might need to apply? You also want to think ahead and prepare for different scenarios. A key to successful project management is using your imagination and thinking about what are some of the things that could come up in a project. That might not necessarily happen, but at least you're thinking through those different scenarios. And if A happens, what will I do? If B happens, how will I address that? So it's about monitoring kind of what's happening day to day, but it's also thinking ahead about challenges that might come up and how you can address them. You also want to ensure, you know, one thing specifically with your funder too, with that communication piece, is make sure that they have foundational information about the Indian health system. So any project that you're working on, the subject matter becomes key to success. So you want to make sure that your funder has kind of that baseline knowledge that you're using to move your project forward and that you're working through on all of the tasks. You know, what is that problem that you're trying to solve with your project, and helping your funder to understand and get that baseline of knowledge that will help support the overall goals of the project. Another key piece to making sure that the stakeholders and interacting with them is successful is, you know, share an executive summary with tribal stakeholders. So not only making sure that stakeholders have that baseline knowledge, is make sure that maybe that they have an executive summary of your project so they know what they're doing. And especially with tribal stakeholders who might not be as familiar with your project, are very busy, so that you have that quick at a glance look at your project that you can share with them to make it really easy for them to answer your questions or get you the information you need to move on with your project. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of issues that can come up with your project and some ways to address them. So the first example is a task required by the project is taking longer to complete than expected. And taking longer to complete can include, it's taking more labor hours, so it's taking staff longer time to actually do the work. Or it could be, and sometimes it's a combination of these two, it could be a situation where it's taking longer time-wise. So maybe that staff member is busy and they haven't gotten to what you need them to do. So the risk to your project with this scenario is you could go over budget. So if it's taking them more labor hours to get the work done, that could put you over budget. It could also lead to missing deadlines that you've already established by the funder. So you've got the deadline set in your work plan, but it's taking longer than anticipated to get it done, and that completion date is at risk. So some of the ways you could mitigate this issue is, you know, ahead of time, before it even comes up, you know, make sure you're meeting with staff working on the task regularly so they can talk to you about any barriers that they've run into. If they say, you know, I just really can't get to it this week, then you can negotiate a different date or work with them to reprioritize tasks. So that's a good way. Meeting with them regularly is a good way to head off this problem even before it begins. If you run into this issue, it's already happened, you know, the first thing to do is determine the reason for the delay. And once you know the reason for the delay, then you can give guidance on next steps and how to address the delay. Maybe that's, as I mentioned, reprioritizing tasks. Maybe it's assigning it to somebody else, but you can determine all of that through those conversations. And then, as we talked about before, make sure you're updating the funder, make sure you're communicating with them. So update them as soon as you know that there's an issue, and let them know how you're planning to address it. And the same applies to leadership team members within your organization. So make sure that communication is transparent, both outside of your organization and inside with your leadership team. Another example I have is maybe the main point of contact at your funder's organization, so that person you were working with closely through the course of the contract has left. You know, staff turnover can be a really common challenge in project management. So the risk to your project if this happens is information or approval delays. You may have to spend time orienting the new contact, especially if they're not familiar with your project at all, and that could put you over budget. So mitigation, again, that communication, it's always key. So communicate early and often with the new point of contact, provide an orientation to the project, and ensure this is a key to helping with not going over budget with orientation time. Make sure your work plan is detailed and it's up to date. So then you can just pull it up and walk your funder through that work plan so they can get an idea of the scope of your project and what you've been doing. And especially if it's detailed, if you have those interim steps laid out, then it's really easy to walk them through. And you could even color code or kind of reorganize your work plan that shows them what they will need to do if they need to review documents or provide input or meet with the team. You can put those tasks into the work plan, especially for if you have a new contact, and that will help them know exactly what's expected of them from the beginning. All right, so the next step is monitoring the project performance. So again, maintain and update that work plan regularly. You also want to make sure that your reporting is current and that it's communicating effectively to everyone that it needs to, including your funder. So this can take a lot of different formats. It might be email internally. There might be certain reporting templates that you need to use. Reporting is a really effective way to communicate with leadership and funders on all of those issues and mitigation strategies. You know, it's good. We've talked about having those regular check-ins, updating your funder regularly, and you could do that on check-in calls and through email. But when you also add that to regular reporting, then that leaves that documentation to make sure that it increases the transparency and so that everyone involved in the project knows what's going on. Reporting provides documentation for telling your story, which is really important. You want to be able to share all of the successes and the challenges and how you overcame them. That's a key piece to the story. And that helps you to meet grant requirements, first and foremost. But then it also can be used for potential future funding. If you're submitting a grant application later on that is for the same work that you had been doing, you have your story right there. You have that narrative that you can use to get additional funding. And then tracking your spending, as I've mentioned previously, reconciling those invoices. So if you've authorized a spend on your contract and the work is then completed by vendors or people outside of your organization, and then they invoice you, you can compare that to your original authorization of the spend. And if you're tracking your budget closely and you have a process in place, then those costs won't be a surprise to you. So again, you know, creating a process for those purchase authorizations so that you as the project manager are the one that is authorizing the spend on your contract. And that's really how you can stay in control of your spend and you don't have staff ordering services or purchasing things without your authorization. And then you also want to track labor. So whoever's billing to your project, how many hours, and if you can set up a system for projecting that out into the future, that really helps so that you can anticipate costs as they come in. So some challenges that can come up with monitoring. You might have some late invoices or any number of budgeting issues. Communication can always be a challenge as well. And there might be some reporting gaps. So if you have staff workloads, maybe you're working on an annual report and you've asked your staff for updates and they've been too busy to get them to you. You know, maybe you don't have a process for collecting the reporting or matching. There might be challenges with matching the project to the reporting requirements. Maybe your funder has given you a list of things that you need to report on that may not necessarily have been documented along the way. So all of these can be challenges in monitoring and then reporting throughout the course of your project. So let's talk about some mitigation strategies for these challenges. You really want to work closely with your accounting staff and set up that invoicing and purchase authorization process ahead of time. So then you can just, every month you can go through and reconcile and see how the budget is going. If possible, develop accounting reports that can be run often. On demand is great. So if you have timesheets, you have labor hours that you can pull reports to see how people are billing your project. If you have reports that can come out of the accounting system that list outstanding purchase authorizations, there's reports for the invoices that have come in. So just work with your accounting team to see what's available and what you can set up. A lot of organizations use different accounting software. So see just check with your accounting team and see what's possible with the software that they use. Again, communication. This is really one of the pillars of effective project management, is you want to communicate early and often and with everyone who touches your project. And then the setup piece. So set up those reporting templates early. These can be in Word docs, they can be in Excel, whatever works for you and fits the requirements of your project. You can always adjust the templates and the timeline as needed. The timeline adjustments may need to be done in partnership with your funder. But again, that communication and talking to them about due dates and the work plan is going to be very important. And then also through communication with your funder, you can adjust any reporting templates that you need. You know, maybe you've set up a template in a Word document and you report the first month or two and the funder comes back and says, you know, I really would like you to add this information on a monthly basis. Is that possible? So then you can adjust those templates as needed. All right. So an example of something that can come up with as you're monitoring and working with your budget. A contract you signed with a vendor included a cancellation fee, but you did not include it in your budget. And the risk with this is going over budget. So mitigation strategies that will help with this is make sure you read all of your contracts carefully and request that other staff do that review as well. So if you miss something, somebody else will catch it. So if you're working with a vendor and outside of your organization and there's a contract involved, just make sure that you read that contract carefully and look for any of those cancellation fees. You want to project for those fees as soon as the contract is executed. So you've reviewed the contract, you've negotiated with the vendor, everyone signs it. As soon as you get that executed contract, put that fee into your budget projections so that you can anticipate that and it doesn't get lost. Now, If something happens and you miss that cancellation fee and it comes in later, you can always try to negotiate with the vendor to reduce that cancellation fee. So that's just another strategy that you can use to reduce your risk of going over budget. All right, so taking corrective action. We've talked a lot about ways to monitor your project. We've talked about the tools that you can use to monitor your project and some of the challenges that can come up and some mitigation strategies. So there are always going to be things that come up with your project. I've mentioned this before. There's always going to be, no matter how organized and how much you communicate, there's always going to be challenges that come up with your project. And here we're going to talk about some ways to take corrective action and make sure we get your project back on track. So adjusting, and this really requires, flexibility and that anticipation of things that might come up. So adjust your work plan and adjust your templates as needed. If you're using a work plan software, like I mentioned with Spreadsheet or with Smartsheet or Excel, you can it's really easy to make adjustments, add columns, add rows, move things around. And again, the work plan is really meant to be that living document that you can use as a tool throughout the course of your project. We also talked about templates that you can adjust, reporting templates that you can adapt to your needs throughout the course of the project. You also want to establish that early and clear communication. So emails, calls, one-on-one, really work to develop those strong relationships with your team and with your funder. So if something comes up, you can just pick up the phone and call your funder and let them know. And then you can document it through your reporting and through emails. And make sure that your team also understands the communication protocols. Establish who can communicate with the funder, who is going to be in on those check-in calls, and communicate that out to everyone. If all of the communication to your funder is going through you as the project manager, just make sure that your team knows that, and make sure that they know who to come to whenever there's a question. With larger projects, you might not be the person answering all of the questions. You might have support staff who are really involved with the day-to-day course of your project, and that they can be, your team can be directed to them to answer questions about your project. Don't be afraid to reach out for help. So set up your online tools, identify your team members and your leadership who can help you. Everyone is really invested in making sure that your project is successful. So identify those team members that you can reach out, even if it's just to bounce ideas off of, or, I think I might be having a situation here that I'm going to need some help addressing. Here's kind of what I'm thinking. What do you think about these different options that we have? So that collaboration is really important. And that also helps with relationship building, which is also key to project management. So anticipate. I've mentioned before that you're going to have challenges that come up that you didn't necessarily see coming, but you can anticipate what some of those might be and then come up with strategies, use the strategies that we talked about in this module to address those challenges, and really trust your instincts and be creative. So we all have, we can all sense maybe when things are happening or might happen. And if you think, I think there might be an issue kind of popping up over here, always trust that instinct. It's never been wrong for me, and I don't know of anyone else who it's been wrong for. So if you think something might be happening, it probably is, and you'll need to address it. And be creative. Project management is really about using your imagination and coming up with creative solutions that might come up very quickly. So, trust yourself and be creative, and you're going to have a great, successful project. Develop those mitigation strategies and implement them as needed. So as things come up, if you already have strategies in your toolbox, then you can pull those out and adapt them as needed. And then you want to document issues and how you solve them. Now, not only is this important just in reporting with the funder and transparency and communication, but it also is important for people who may come along behind you or have a similar project. So, you know, using that creativity that we talked about earlier to solve problems, you might have addressed something that maybe no one had thought about or would think about. So if they can go back and see how you addressed challenges, then that helps them learn and helps them to be effective project managers too. So documentation is really important to not only provide that transparency, but also to teach others and spread that knowledge that you learned through the course of your project. All right, thank you so much for participating in this module. We're going to take a quick break, and then I will turn it over to our next presenter, Dr. Iris Prettypaint.
Our next section here. And my name is Iris Prettypaint, and I'm going to cover the topic today of project closeout. And if you'll notice, we've been going through some phases with you over the course of these modules. And this is the final phase of project management. And if you look at the diagram at the bottom, this will help you to see kind of where we are. So we have at the bottom, you'll see your level of activity going across the top. And every phase that we've taught you so far was both the startup, the planning, the performance, or what we referred to as monitoring, and the closeout. So with that, I want to make sure that you know, you can hear me okay, and that I'm going to go through the slides here with you. Closeout is a part of the process, believe it or not, is about 90% of the work that you'll do. And it'll start with you in the beginning, and it'll stay with you until you close out the work that you've been assigned to do. Closeout comes in the ending, the smallest part of your project, but it actually turns out to be a very, very important part of the way that you manage the scope of work, the way you manage and organize your files, and the way you manage the resources that you have. And so some of the closeout functions that I'll be going through and talking about is both the requirements for the project that you have and the budget management. So when we think about your projects that you have, some of you may have a 12-month, a 1-year project. You may have multiple years. And so you'll want to make sure that your closeout is at the end of each of those years, as well as a overall closeout at the end of the multiple years that are there. As we think about closeout and what it presents to us, I'd like to go over and just kind of give you some thinking about how you can organize yourself for closeout. One of the things that we'll be sharing with you is a sample checklist. And this checklist is just a guide for you. And I would encourage you to develop a closeout checklist that works for you. It has to be able to track all of the deliverables and your final report. And again, you're tracking those deliverables along with your budget, or we call it spend down. And the only way that you can really have those two things come together is to be able to create a filing system that allows you to manage and to track and monitor. And if you're looking for something, you can easily go in and find it and make that a part of your reporting process. And you may or you may not find yourself having to share hard copies of the materials that you are funded to create. but always remember that you should be ready to be able to do that when you need to. So this is just a checklist for you to think about as you have projects that are funded for 1 year. And so you, when you find yourself at the end of that closeout and you've completed all of your required deliverables, you want to make sure that there are two things that you want to have clearly in your mind, and that is the date that you submitted them to the client and the date they were accepted. Those are two different things that you'll need to track, because what will happen is you'll have a deliverable and you'll submit it, your draft, to the client, your first draft, and allow them to give you feedback. And normally that window is a 2-week window for feedback. And then once that comes back to you, you need to build in time for you to be able to take care of those changes and submit the updated copy. As you're doing that, you're going to find that you're going to be tracking the amount of time and labor that it takes to be able to do those things. And that all impacts your budget. So when you have a deliverable, you should be able to look at it, and as you monitor it, to find out basically how much it cost you to be able to create that deliverable, including the labor and other direct costs. And that's how you're able to see if you were on time, you were within budget, and then you'll start to hear people talk about the quality. So you want to make sure that you kind of have that in the back of your mind, was this high quality, was it on time and in budget? So the funder is important. The communication that you have with them on how long it's going to take for them to review a deliverable is important to keep track of that. And sometimes you'll find yourself in closeout. It may be toward the end of your project, but yet you still have a lot of things to do. And this, you'll find yourself here many times over. And that's why we've been talking tirelessly about that organization and what that process entails for you. So again, if you have a 1-year grant and you're doing your closeout for that 1 year, that's kind of like the checklist that you'll be creating. But if you happen to have multi-funded years, then you want to make sure that you have closeouts for each one of those years, and then one overall closeout that you're able to share with the funder. And if you had maybe years that were not funded, then, and that contract ends, then that'll be your final closeout for that year. When you have financials for your closeout, after you have completed all of your financial internal auditing for yourself and with the funder, and there are no exceptions, everything's been resolved and you're in agreement, and then you can do your last voucher or invoice, and you can close out the documents for that designated project. So I'd like to pull up on the screen a sample for you of a project closeout checklist. So this is a sample that you're going to have in your hands. And you know what I do as samples is I just start to adapt them to my particular project. And these are step-by-step activities. So every time that you take one step, it's important that you monitor the dates that you completed those, and then always use the box for your comments. So there might be things that, you know, when you kicked off your project, there were things that might have been clarified with the funder, and you can write those down so that you have documentation of them. So the first step here is to review the grant for the specific closeout requirements. And so sometimes a funder will tell you specifically what they want you to do. They want you to, for example, they would like for you both to submit a open Word file and a closed PDF file. They might ask you to make sure that you have things that are 508 compliant before you submit those. And that's just another opportunity for you to know the specific things that a funder can ask you to do. They may ask you and add to your contract that they want you to make a final presentation. So when you add that to your deliverables, that'll be another indication for you that you need to get ready for doing a comprehensive overview of everything that was done in your project year. And you highlight the accomplishments. You also talk about the challenges, how you mitigated those, and then you begin to show the findings of your work, and you can share that, you know, in either a PowerPoint or a written report or both. Another step that's very important to close out is that you take time to organize your project files. And so over the course of your work, you probably have created many folders, many different files. And during closeout, what you'll do is you'll take all the final deliverables that you created in that project year, and you will organize one folder that has nothing but final deliverables that were submitted. And you put those together, and again, be mindful that you'll either have both an open Word file and a PDF version, so that you people, if they want to manipulate the work that you're creating, they have the opportunity to do that. Pay close attention to how you name your project files, so that if you know that you're going to create sort of a code at the beginning that names your contract, you would have that first on all files. And then you could put either the year, if it's your base year, or if it's option year 1, or if it's just the 1-year contract, and then you would name the file. You could use your task structure in that naming of your file. And my recommendation would be to always use an underscore when you have a space between any words in your file structure. And the reason for that is that sometimes when you're closing out or saving to a hard drive all of your files, if they're not written in a correct way, then maybe you'll lose portions of those files. So just pay attention to that as you archive your project. And so there's 2 kinds of archive systems that you can create. And one of them would be all of the work that you did to develop the final products, and then all the programmatic work that you did on the project, so that somebody could look at your archive system and they could see both your programmatic and your final deliverables work that you did. And again, the dates of all of that work is very important to have. That's why this work starts with you in the beginning and follows you throughout. Step 3 is to make sure that you're, that you have everything signed, that you need to have signatures on, so that if you have, for example, any travel documents, any documents that require a signature for invoices, and that you have all of those things properly signed and organized. That's a part of your closeout. Can you scroll up just a little bit? The 4th step is to reconcile all of the expenses that you've had. And so if you build a system in the beginning financially, and we'll be talking about that here in just a little bit, is that when you build that financial system for yourself to be able to track your actuals, and we also do projected costs. And when we reconcile something, that way you don't find yourself at the end of the contract having a bill come in and you didn't document it and track it, and it's still something that you still have to reconcile. So That's a really important step in closeout, that you have that kind of system for yourself. And again, you know, we're always talking about signature and documenting who submits what at what time, and to be able to have that available to the team that you're working with. And we refer both to a project officer and a funder. Those are interchangeable here. And you want to make sure that even though you sent out a deliverable, the way that you structure that is you ask your funder or your project officer to reply to your email that they received your deliverable. And that in the same thing in closeout is you want to make sure that they've received everything that you've submitted, and you have documentation for that. That is important for you to have. And can you scroll up, please, to 7? And the final step we have here for you just to consider is to be able to work with the vendors that you have in your project work, and any consultants that you engage, and that you track their work right along with everything that you do, any of their contracts that you negotiated, the signed contract, the invoicing of the work that you gave them by deliverable, and then reconciling that, making sure they receive their payment, and always getting documentation that things, you know, followed through and were able to get to the end. Okay, back to the slide set, I think. So I'd like to close today with some helpful tips for you. And you'll find that the trainers have all mentioned these in their presentations. And the first one is, I'd like to remind you that whoever your funder is, whatever department that resources come out of, it's helpful to think of that as foundational knowledge frameworks. So if you're going to be working in and around, for example, the Indian Health Service, it's important to have that, to be mindful of that in the beginning of your work, when you start your initiation, and as you go into planning and implementation. Those kinds of things help you to become a strong project manager, and to help your team with terminology, with, you know, the protocols for how the style guides, how people are, you know, how you talk about different parts of your funding. So this is really a really important piece for project managers as they get ready. Even though it's here in closeout, I would just remind you of that in the beginning as well. When you start your planning, and you start to think about it in 4 quarters, if you have a 1-year grant, and when you schedule your deliverables out, you can put deliverables in those quarters that need to be done in that sequence, and planning that process will help you to see which part of your grant is going to have the most work involved to be able to do the work that you need to do. We talk about things at 6 months to be able to have those milestones. And then again, at the end of the grant. So there's things at the end of your grant that you want to make sure that you're able to do. And that is to be able to have a strong final report, to be able to do a very comprehensive presentation to anybody on the work that you just did within that year. And if there are multiple years, at the end of those years. And so again, we're sort of confirming with you and just letting you know how important these tips are. And so communication and closeout is important. And I think in your 3rd quarter, and definitely in your 4th quarter, you can bring up the topic of closeout. And sometimes funders appreciate that, because they get so busy with all of their work that, you know, a reminder in closeout is, you know, when should we give you the outline to the final report for your feedback? You very seldom will ever create a final report and not have feedback at the beginning. That would save you a lot of time to get an outline to your funder so they can see what you're thinking about. To communicate with your stakeholders. We have this many meetings left. In the stakeholders, this has been what we've asked of you, and this is how we're going to handle the transition for closeout. All of that is very important for everybody that interfaces with your project. In closeout, it's important that you have clear expectations and that you can agree on those expectations as a team, and that you have timelines that are attached to your scope of work. And this goes back to what Kim was talking about, your work plan, and knowing that that work plan will always change for you throughout the course of the project. And if you have a plan and you have clear expectations, your closeout will go very smoothly. If you don't, it'll go the opposite direction, is that it'll create more work for you than you can imagine to try to cover all those things. When you get ready for closeout, it requires a different kind of monitoring of your budget, so that you have to know basically every month, and then as you get down closer, every week, what you look like. And sometimes it's every day. That's how closely you can get down to the spend down of your project. One tip is to limit the amount of leave that your team can take in closeout, because every time they take vacation or they're not there at work, that means that you have that labor to manage in your closeout. So that's just a tip that I wanted to share with you. Another set of tips for you today is, again, to document everything. And once you set a meeting for a schedule, I would recommend that you don't change your meeting schedule, because once you start to move things around that are standing meetings, that does something to a team. And what it does is it gets in their mind that we can move any kind of meeting, any day, any time. And then it's really hard to get a team meeting set for everybody. And particularly in closeout, I think that you have a standing team meeting and you'll have to decide what part of that agenda you want to do closeout, or if you want a closeout meeting for people to be able to join to see what they have left that's assigned to them. In closeout, you can begin to identify future projects or grant opportunities. And what I'll say is, you can do that throughout the year. You can wait till the end for that. Sometimes a funder doesn't know if they're going to have resources available. And other times, as you get into your work and they start to see what kind of management you're doing and how well things are going, they might give you other projects to do. And I just want to say here briefly, lessons learned, or what people are calling best practices, that also requires a level of management. There are different types of lessons learned. There's a step-by-step process that you go through to be able to capture those. And so I'll say here as a tip is to come up with a plan for yourself on what kind of process do you want for lessons learned. Sometimes it'll be key phrases that you want to make sure that you capture, and who will do that, and when will you discuss lessons learned. Will it be at the end of the first quarter? Will it be when something comes up during that quarter? And then how will you write about those at the end of the project is very important. And lessons learned, you're also going to learn from things that challenged you and you may have failed and mitigated it. And those are things that funders appreciate, is when you can say, this is what our lesson was, and this is how we mitigated it, And this is what we did. We reset the course of action, and then the best practices are there for you to be able to share with other grantees. You know, this is what worked well for us, and I think people really appreciate that. When you stay within a scope of work, it shows in your closeout. If you have scope creep, that's going to show in your closeout. And so last but not least, I want to share with you how important it is to take care of yourself through this process. This is challenging work. It's work that requires, sometimes even though you end your day, at the end of the day, you're still thinking about your work. And so it's stressful. And so as a team and a project manager and a team, I think it's important that you communicate to each other what self-care means for your team, and to give those kinds of support to each other. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. We will be shifting gears and talking about no-cost extensions. My name is Julie Cahoon, and I'll be the trainer for this session. So as we begin talking about no-cost extensions, it's important to think about what a no-cost extension is. So we're going to go ahead and define a no-cost extension. And so a no-cost extension is a mechanism that extends a project's timeline past the original project date, or what was originally discussed before you started your project. And so no-cost extensions, it's kind of in the name. They extend the time period without adding additional funding to the project. So a project team will have to use the same amount of budget dollars over a longer period of time. So no-cost extensions also don't add additional work. You're maintaining the same level of work, the same number of deliverables. You're just going to be performing those over a longer period of time. And so when we think about no-cost extensions, there's a number of ways and causes of a no-cost extension. And so what I'm going to cover here are just some of the causes of no-cost extension. Sometimes those are external causes. So those are things that are beyond your control or beyond your organization's control. And this is most often the most common type of a no-cost extension. And so examples of external causes of a no-cost extension include a change in project scheduling or staff. For example, the federal government experiences, or if the federal government experiences a shutdown, this will temporarily stall review and approval of final grant materials and budgeting related to your project. Another example of an external cause for a no-cost extension is IRB process, and this can be either tribal IRB process or the regional IRB process. Oftentimes these processes can take longer than expected due to varying IRB meeting cycles and the review process itself. And then another one is review of final reports can take months to clear federal review. So depending on the type of grant you have and who your funder might be, the final review of certain deliverables can take longer if you're working with a federal agency. Oftentimes you're going to have to manage the review process of multiple offices within a single agency. And so this process itself can often range from 1 to 4 months, just depending on the particular funder that you're managing. And so at this point, we're going to go ahead and talk about some internal causes for no-cost extensions. And so the difference between external and these internal causes is that external causes are beyond your control, and internal causes are things that are related to issues that arise within the project, oftentimes related to management or, again, things that are not imposed upon your project. So examples of this include outreach challenges with external stakeholders, unanticipated work within the statement of work. The work plan did not capture all of the tasks and deadlines. And so those are the specific bullets to those, and I'm just going to add a little bit more detail to put some of those into context. So if you're having outreach challenges with external stakeholders, this is outside of your control, but at the same time, it's something that project management tools and strategies might be able to help support. So if you're doing a community needs assessment and you need to reach out to stakeholders or to engage the community, and you're not getting as much engagement as you would like, that's something that would call for a no-cost extension potentially. And then another is anticipated work within the statement of work. And so what this might mean is that in your initial review of the statement of work, there was maybe a component of the work that you didn't realize that needed to occur. So for example, using the same community health needs assessment example, say you were just anticipating to do a community needs assessment and you ran with that initially, but then you realized you needed to have maybe a 50% response rate to a survey related to health needs assessment. And you, when you initially did your survey, you only got 25%. So you're going to need additional time to recoup that 25% response rate. So that would be just an example of some unanticipated work related to the SOW that would lead to a no-cost extension potentially. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and shift into some of the real costs. So there are all of the internal aspects of a no-cost extension, but we're really going to define that more into what does that mean? What are those real costs? So there are things that may not be tied to a dollar amount per se, but what does that impact of a no-cost extension mean to you and to your project? So these are just some of the examples of what another cost might be related to a no-cost extension. And the first is wait time. So if you have a no-cost extension and that has been executed and you have more time to complete a particular project, it does also mean that there's going to be more time involved. So there'll be potentially extended time waiting for approvals to the deliverables or even to the process itself of initiating a no-cost extension. And then the next thing is, each project is based on a certain amount of time frame. And so you may have staff that are obligated to start working on another program project as soon as yours concludes. And if your project goes over, those same staff may no longer be available to you, and you may have to retrain or ask another staffer to step over or impose on the other project where your current staff was supposed to go. So it's having conflicting staff availability and scheduling due to the no-cost extension. Another one is if you have multiple grant years occurring at the same time, and this will impact the management of your project as well as the staffing. It becomes complicated and it can overwhelm staff if you have one grant year that was supposed to end on X date that is now, moving into the next grant year. You then, for that extended period, maybe it's 2 months or 3 months, you have two concurring grant years going on, and you're completing work on one while starting work on the second grant year. And so that can be difficult to manage oftentimes, and then it also can be difficult for your staff to manage as well. The next is updates specific to the no-cost extension. And so you're going to need to take special time out of your planning to include no-cost extension updates, whether you're communicating that to staff, to perhaps tribal council or tribal health board, and even to your project officer. So it just adds additional work into your planning phases and into your updates. The next is you'll also need to engage accounting to confirm the no-cost extension process. And so this also then means more work for you as a project manager to outreach to internal staff, and then also working with your accounting team to ensure all the details are in place and that all budgetary demands are covered and that all the work will be met under the no-cost extension period. And then the last is, again, managing overlapping efforts. A no-cost extension does require time and management. So it does add more to your plate. And so if you're already doing a lot of things at once, a no-cost extension does become an additional piece to your plate for a longer time than you had thought. So there's just a number of non-budgetary costs to a no-cost extension. And so the next thing I want to do is kind of walk you through the steps for executing a no-cost extension. So there are some specific steps for no-cost extension, and this will just start from the very beginning, from when the project manager first identifies a conflict with the project work and a need to extend the end of the grant period in order to complete the project. And so if you've been monitoring your project, you will probably have already noted that there is a certain risk. And so taking the first example of a community health needs assessment, if in your updates to your project officer, your health assessment is going to be the last thing that you do in a grant year, and everything leading up to your assessment, building the survey, getting that community outreach, engaging the right people to help you get the survey responses that you need for your assessment, you may have noticed that there are certain risks involved. And so for this particular example, for step one, you identify that you may not have enough time, or the engagement is taking more time than you had expected. And so the first step of a no-cost extension is identifying that there is a risk and a need to carry one out. The next step is then to have an internal discussion about your identified risk. So you'll want to go ahead and meet with your project director and express your concern. You'll also need to connect with your internal billing or accounting office to understand the impacts from the budgetary aspect of your work. So the next step is then just having that internal dialogue. Is there really a need to do a no-cost extension? Are there other mitigations to meet your deliverable and the demands for the health assessment that you're conducting in this example? So after that internal discussion that you have, you'll need to address your budget. If you need to spend more time with staff conducting the outreach, or you need to add a different software system to gather data online or electronically to get those response rates that you need, how will this impact your budget? Can your budget handle the staff or the software that you need to extend beyond the project end date, but still keep within your budget? So the next step is then, as a project manager, look at your budget. How have things been progressing so far? Is there space to extend without adding additional budgets, and asking your project officer for that monetary support? Okay, so then we'll step into the last few steps here. So we have 4, 5, 6, and 7. So once you've reviewed the budget, you've communicated with your internal staff. The next is taking it to your project officer. So during your next update, or you schedule a separate meeting with him just to talk, him or her, to talk about this specifically, you're going to just raise the issue, and then you'll just explain that as you've been continuously monitoring your project, this has come up. And if you've been, communicating and updating with your project officer throughout, they may already be aware of the fact that this was a potential risk that the whole group and team was aware of, and it may not be a surprise. And so more often than not, it's not going to be a surprise to your project officer that you may need time for a particular project if you've been regularly updating them on the progress. So at this stage, you'll want to, again, present it, offer the reasonings behind why you think a no-cost extension is fair or just reasonable, and then what kind of timeline is associated with that. So you want to come to the discussion with some of these things already worked out, and that's what those internal meetings help you do. The next step then is for the project officer to maybe connect with your organization's billing or accounting office to communicate any finer details related to the grant agreement or something similar. And then the next step is then internal and kind of away from your work as a project manager. The project officer will often then take this information and go to, their internal agreement office and kind of put the modification for your project into place. At that point, then the last step is that the no-cost extension is then reviewed by your program director, your billing office, and even yourself to ensure that all the details that were previously discussed are all met within that modification, at which point it will become executed and that will become your new project end date within that no-cost extension modification. And so just to kind of recap, the no-cost extension, it adds after the no-cost extension has been executed and modified, the next step is to add the extended period to your work plan and to your project schedule. So you'll want to start incorporating the impact of your no-cost extension into your project management documents. So you'll want to get that into communication. So you'll want to meet with your project team and review the no-cost extension, what the impacts are to your project, to their workload, and really help them understand what it is that they need to do and what the impact is to their project. Then you begin to add the no-cost extension efforts as part of your updates to your project officer. So you really just add this as another element of your reporting process so that it just, you really fully integrate this extended period into all of your documents, including your updates to your no-cost extension or to your project officer. And again, it's a no-cost extension, so this means that you will not be receiving additional funding. You're simply doing the same amount of work that you had already discussed, just over a longer period of time. And so this brings me to my last slide about no-cost extensions. And so I want to go ahead and just discuss a little bit about the difference between a no-cost extension and a carryover. So these are both mechanisms within agreements and within grants that support the execution of project work. The no-cost extension, we'll just go, bullet by bullet about what the differences are. So the no-cost extension extends the project beyond the original end date. For a grant carryover, the budget is applied to a new project period. So for the no-cost extension, you're not carrying anything over, you're just extending the project date. For a carryover, you're applying leftover funds to a new project period. The no-cost extension does not impact your SOW. You do the same amount of work as what you'd originally agreed upon. For a carryover, you are impacting your budget. You're adding more work to your SOW for that particular grant year to make up for the added budgets. So for a no-cost extension, there are no additional funds added to the project. So that's just a point to emphasize. For a carryover, you are adding new budget dollars to your project. And then using the current project budget to carry over more time to complete a project. So typically no-cost extensions are implemented to support the work of a particular project. So for the example, we were using a community health needs assessment. For a carryover, you're rolling over current project dollars and using them into the next project year. And that usually is to then add a project or a new set of work into the new project year. So say you didn't do the needs assessment, you have extra funds, you carry that over to the next grant year, and then you can, do the community needs assessment in that next year. And then the last one is just an example situation. So the date of the task was extended due to delays in review. So that's about, no-cost extension is usually implemented to address engagement issues, or say a final document is taking longer to review. Those are instances where no-cost extension is appropriate. Whereas with a carryover, an event was not able to happen due to unforeseen circumstances within one grant year, so then you would just carry over that event dollars into the next grant year and perform the grant in the next grant year. So those are the differences between a no-cost extension and carryover. And so we will go ahead and move into our next session.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Iris Pretty Paint. I'm going to serve as your trainer for the project reporting section of the module. Project reporting, the reason that we do reporting is to be able to finalize our work that we have on our project and to provide that report to our granting agency. Project reporting can serve as a powerful learning opportunity for project managers and team members as they prepare a summary of all of the work that they did for the entire period of the project. Some of the benefits of reporting include giving your project officer an opportunity to review your drafts, to give you feedback, to finalize that document, and to give you formal acceptance of your deliverables. Another benefit is to be able to complete the work and reconcile your budget with the work that you've completed, and to make sure that you have enough for your final report at the end of the closeout period. Another benefit is to be able to track, to look at the changes that you've went through, the issues that you've encountered in project management, and to articulate those in a way for lessons learned in your report. And I'll say a little bit more about lessons learned as we go forward. And another benefit is to be able to always be organized in your documentation and to identify the processes that you have developed over time and how those processes have improved with your execution of your scope of work. So in your final report planning, one of the areas that is going to be always helpful is to look at your statement of work, your scope of work, and see what it says directly related to your final report. If it tells you what due dates the drafts are due, what the due date is for the final report, and time for feedback, if there's a window there, if there's a page limitation, if there's a style guide that you should be using for your final report, this all comes into your initial planning for your report. One of the techniques in report writing is to begin to map out the components of your report, to develop an outline of those components. And for example, here we have some suggestions for you that maybe you have a component on the progress and results of your work, to document your successes and challenges, lessons learned, and any other additional information that will help your funder understand the overall implementation, monitoring, and closeout of the work that you did. So again, developing an outline, a table of contents early on, and as you learn the detailed information that you're doing, you can provide a copy of that outline to your project officer and let them have any input or areas they'd like for you to add, or they would like to have you delete, or they would like to have you change. So that's always a beneficial process. And that way the report that you're starting to develop the narrative for, you don't find yourself writing areas that are in the long run will be taken out at the end. And the dissemination of your report, that could also be a part of the details that you get for your work, and who are you going to disseminate that report to the community, to the tribal council, to other stakeholders that might be involved in your work. And your funder will always run those ideas by them, because with different audiences, final reports sometimes will take a little bit different format. There might be different sections that your funder would like for you to include or to develop for that audience. And so that's always helpful to have those in mind as you prepare that for your final report. When you get ready to tell your project story, there are 4 areas that I'd like to share with you that you can use to tell your story. And we'll share examples of each one of these areas, but let me just go through them with you, and then I'll touch on them as we get into the samples. So the first area that you can use in telling your project story is the use of images. And as you look at the work that you do, maybe either virtually or on site or in documentation, you can begin to collect images that you can use. Sometimes they might be photographs, they might be copies of documents, they might be resolutions, but whatever you decide, whatever images you decide to use, always keep in mind that you want to get a signed consent. If you have individuals, particularly youth, anyone under the age of 18, you should have an adult signed consent form, and keep those in your files, and you can that can be a part of your closeout documentation. Another area that's very helpful as you begin to tell the story of your work is to put things in the words of the people that you are providing the service to or creating products for. And that means that you can again ask for permission to quote people, or you can have the quotes be anonymous, or if they're a part of something they submitted to you, you can lift a quote out of documents and use those in your final report. And again, always get permission, especially if you're going to use an individual's name from a community. And you can ask them real simple questions like, do you want your tribal affiliation? Do you want your role in the community? You know, do you need an organization, you know, behind your name if we're going to quote you? Give them time to get clearance on that quote, especially if they're affiliated with an organization. Another area is the use of graphs. And let me just say a little bit about graphs. So if you have a very complex project and that project has a lot of moving pieces to it, a very, very complicated relationships, that is why you would use a graph. If you don't use a graph, if you have a small amount of data and you can say what you could say in a sentence or two, then don't use a graph. But a graph, what it does is it helps your reader to see any kind of trends that you encountered. You can show in a graph the patterns. If you're looking at any kind of patterns in your work that you're doing, a graph can help you to explain that. And most importantly, a graph can help you to show relationships. And if you're wanting to connect up different sets of data, then a graph is perfect for you to use. And then the last one, the visual aids. We do something with infographics, and it's you know, a screenshot of media, or it's a screenshot of a final report, or a screenshot of a poster, or a handout. And an infograph is to be able to put a lot of information in a small amount of space, but yet still tell your story so that anyone's looking at you know, your infograph, they can truly understand all of the work that you did, and you see samples of that work. So the first one that I'd like to show you is an example of some images that we've created over time. And sometimes, again, if you're wanting to communicate a particular message, and that message is going to entail a group of people, that it would serve the purpose to be able to see them, then usually we'll always encourage you to do group photos in your project work, so that if you have an opportunity to get everyone together that's involved in the work, that's always helpful for funders to see, if you're able to do that on site. If not, then you can have people that are on site, you know, take pictures, and you can manipulate those to be able to tell your story. But images are powerful. You can also, you know, have some text message to say who might be in the photo, or what was going on at the time the photo was taken. Here's a sample of a couple quotes. The one on your left-hand side, you know, you have text that come before the quote, and then you pull out from that text a quote that people can, they both can read it in the text and as a standalone, and then you can follow that up with continued text at the bottom. And again, quotes are powerful words in people's own, in the way they would say something. And it's, you know, it doesn't matter. You see the style. Sometimes you can add dates in there to help the reader to understand when this was. And then another one is to pull the quote, so it's bolded, and it has, you know, like boxes around it that are colored, so it really pops in your report. And again, the name of the people that you're taking that quote from, their position, and who they're affiliated with is always helpful to the reader to know who you're quoting. This is an example of a graph. Again, you can see the complexity of it. You can see down the left-hand side are the names of everyone that you're reporting data on, and across the top are the percentages that the data is being recorded in. It's color-coded, and I think that if people really want to understand, again, they can see the trends, they can see a pattern here, and they can see the relationship that your project is having with each one of the entities. Another example is a graph, a chart showing all the percentages of responses to people. You can show priorities. You can show, you know, what different organizations are responding to. And so you can color code those, so they're very easy to read. Quickly, you can make sense of it. And then the one that just stands out for you is the 51%. Again, you want to have big numbers to be able to report this. And again, it's a figure in your final report. Some of the visual aids that we've used in final reporting is, you know, there are so many elements to the work that you do. You want to make sure that you're able to point out, for example, the one on the left are all of the priorities supported by tribes. So these are numerous priorities, and you want to show them, you know, and usually people will look for their priority out of the list. They're not necessarily ranked in order, but they're a list of all the priorities that your project might have. And then over on your right-hand side is again a detailed description of how you can report out responses, maybe from a survey, or how you acquired those priorities. And again, you can use those visual aids to help you to do your report writing. So with that, thank you. This is the conclusion of Module 3, and we will be online with you for a live discussion. Thank you.